Good morning, guys. There are guys who are still struggling with parking. They should be here in the next 5 minutes. So, in the next 5 minutes, we're certainly going to start. My apologies for the delay. Thank you. Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. Good greetings to and welcome to the Competition Commission. And I think let me acknowledge the Minister of Public Enterprises, the Commissioner, the panel, and the Deputy Commissioners. We shall now start our proceedings in terms of this press announcement. You know that today we are presenting the final findings and recommendations or the report on retail market inquiry. So without further ado, I will hand over to our Chief Economist, Mr. James Hodge.
Thanks, Minister Patel, Commissioner Bonakele, Deputy Commissioner Ratchisusu, the panel members, Professor Halton Cheadle, Lulama Mtanga, and the head of the technical team, Yongama Njisani, and our technical team, members of the media and other stakeholders. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to the release of the final report of the Grocery Retail Market Inquiry. A market inquiry is a very important part of the Competition Commission's toolkit. Whereas most of the other measures we have at our disposal are there to ensure competition doesn't get worse, a market inquiry looks at how we can improve competition in a market. It identifies market features that hinder competition and seeks to unblock them, promoting greater levels of competition in the future. Equally, if not more important, market inquiries also seek to understand hindrances to greater participation in markets by small and historically disadvantaged businesses, and to also unblock these barriers to market access. In this manner, they can contribute to building a more inclusive economy and society. Reducing market concentration, increasing participation by SMEs, and transformation of the economy are all important pillars of the national economic agenda and indeed the mandate of the Commission itself. It was the continued concentration and lack of transformation of markets in the past 20 years which resulted in important amendments to the Competition Act in the last year. These amendments ensure that active steps to deconcentrate markets and increase participation gain more prominence in our work at the Commission. The goal of a more inclusive economy is not only to redress past injustices, but is also essential to a more dynamic, competitive and growing economy. Improving access to markets provides greater opportunities for entrepreneurs to introduce new products, fill niche demand and challenge the incumbents. In doing so, more of the population will determine their own destinies rather than being reliant on others for employment. Consumers also benefit in the process from innovative products, greater choice and lower prices. And this is probably no more so than in grocery retail, the subject of this market inquiry, where there is enormous potential for a much larger and more dynamic base of small and historically disadvantaged businesses to participate. This was a prominent reason for selecting grocery retail as the focus of a market inquiry, and the Commission hopes that the conclusion of the inquiry will provide direction and impetus to unlocking this potential, both in the activities of the Commission, but also other spheres of government. So I'd now like to invite Professor Cheadle to take us through the final findings and recommendations of the inquiry.
Thank you, James. Minister, Commissioner and Deputy Commissioners, Ms. Lulama Mtanga, my co-member on the panel, and Yongama Njisani, the head of the technical team, and all of you stakeholders and members of the media. I welcome you. A market inquiry in general seeks to understand whether any market features may be hindering competition, but also undermining the purposes of the Competition Act. These purposes include, among others, ensuring SMMEs have an equitable opportunity to participate in the economy, to promote transformation, and to provide consumers with greater product choice. Following the publication of the terms of reference, The inquiry officially commenced on the 27th of November 2015. In conducting the inquiry, due regard was given to ensuring that the processes that were followed were both thorough and fair. The inquiry reached out and received submissions, both written and oral, from numerous stakeholders operating at different levels of the grocery retail value chain. Among these stakeholders were various national and provincial government departments, industry regulators, industry associations, national supermarket chains, and emerging challenger retailers, small and independent retailers, buyer groups, property owners, developers, and managers of and banking institutions, FMCG suppliers, spaza shop owners, and academic research institutions. To give you a sense of the numbers, the inquiry received well over 500 submissions from the main parties, held over 80 roundtable discussions, as well as public hearings in the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Gauteng. These public hearings were supplemented with 6 mini public hearings in the form of site visits and revisits in Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, and Northwest. In addition, the inquiry also conducted site visits to spaza shop owners, grocery retailers, wholesalers, and other stakeholders at a number of sites in towns and cities where local grocery retailing issues had been brought to its attention. These submissions made up the substantial body of information, evidence, and data which provided the basis for the inquiry's final findings and recommendations, as set out in the final report being launched here today. The overarching objective of the grocery inquiry was to get a deeper understanding of the grocery retail sector and the features of this market that have led to increased concentration and a diminishing space for small and independent retail in both urban and non-urban economies. In township economies, there's been a noticeable decline in South African-owned spaza shops as national grocery chains and immigrant retailers increasingly moved in to these areas. In urban areas, the big 4 national chains, Shoprite Checkers, Pick n Pay, Spar, and Woolworths, dominate shopping malls and convenience centers, with emerging national chains making limited headway and a dearth of specialist stores and independent general traders. This situation is in stark contrast to most countries which have a large, thriving, and dynamic ecosystem of small and independent grocery retailers and specialist food stores. The inquiry confirmed these trends and in the process identified 3 broad areas that require intervention in order to promote greater competition and consumer choice and open up access to markets for greater participation by SMMEs and historically disadvantaged South Africans. I now turn to the inquiry's final findings and recommendations. And the first concerns exclusive leases. This area involves exclusive leases and tenant mix clauses negotiated by the national chains in shopping malls across the country. Shopping malls predominate as the favored shopping destination for South Africans, particularly in urban areas, with almost 2,000 malls nationally. These malls account for roughly half of all grocery sales nationally. The inquiry found that well over 70% of these shopping centers are subject to exclusive lease agreements. What is even more concerning about this picture is that these exclusive lease agreements endure sometimes for significant periods of time, some up to 20 and 40 years. These agreements not only keep out other national retail chains, they also deny opportunities for emerging chains to get traction in the market by locating where the bulk of consumers do their weekly and monthly shopping. Of even greater concern, these agreements also systematically deny the opportunity for specialist stores and independent entrepreneurs to locate in the mall if they compete with any of the national chain's product lines. These agreements not only hinder competition, but they also deny opportunities for SMEs and historically disadvantaged entrepreneurs to participate in the economy, and they deny consumers the benefit of a broader product choice. The inquiry did not find any compelling justification for the continued existence of these exclusive lease agreements. On the contrary, and in support of the inquiry's position, which I will elaborate shortly, the inquiry found that the industry conduct is beginning to change, with diminishing support for these exclusive lease agreements, and the national supermarket chains have started to waive the enforcement of these exclusive provisions in some instances. Consequently, the inquiry is of the firm view that exclusive leases need to end. As such, the inquiry recommends the following approach to eliminating exclusive leases. There must be an immediate cessation in the enforcement of existing exclusivity clauses against specialist and SMME stores in shopping malls in order to open the sector up to participation by all these players. Immediate cessation against all grocery retailers, whether national or emerging chains, in non-urban areas where there are fewer alternative malls present. So that deals with what we recommend as an immediate cessation. No exclusivity in new lease agreements or in lease renewals in order to stop the practice going forward. And then finally, in respect of existing exclusivity clauses, they're phasing out over a 5-year period. Now, the inquiry recommends that this is achieved through voluntary undertakings by the national supermarket chains, a process that the inquiry has initiated but not finalized. The recommendation is that the Commission should, within 6 months from today, continue the inquiry's process and secure voluntary compliance with the recommendations, failing which legislation in the form of regulations or a code of practice is recommended to be introduced. These recommendations, though, do not preclude the Commission from pursuing litigation in respect of existing complaints and evidence gathered in this inquiry. A final decision on a referral to the tribunal will have regard to the national supermarket chains' responses to the attempt to get voluntary consent. The second concerns fair trading practices. This area relates to what I broadly refer to as fair trading practices. It relates to the treatment of SMMEs in the context of both rental rates within shopping malls and the buyer power of national supermarket chains in the procurement of fast-moving consumer goods, and the implications for the competitiveness of wholesalers as well as small and independent grocery retailers. The inquiry found that the buyer power of the national retail chains enables them to get far more favorable treatment by suppliers relative to the buyer groups and wholesalers that service the small and independent retailers, including spaza shops. This is in the form of higher rebates and qualification for rebates, some of which are not even given to the wholesalers and buyer groups. The inquiry has found that some of these differences are justified, but this is not always the case. For instance, some of the rebates paid to the national supermarket chains are higher than those paid to the buyer groups, even when the volumes purchased by these retailers are smaller than those bought by the buyer groups. Similarly, some rebate categories are not open to wholesalers merely because they don't retail, even if the traders purchasing from them do incur similar costs. Some rebate categories just do not seem to have any obvious rationale. This differential in treatment for grocery products makes it far more difficult for small and independent retailers to compete against national supermarket chains and has contributed to the national supermarket chains' dominance. This is of great concern to the inquiry, especially as these chains are seemingly evolving from pure supermarkets into convenience shopping. In this regard, the inquiry highlights their recent direct entry into the township spaza shop segment, In other words, the advantages obtained through their significant buyer power will now, going forward, extend to all forms of retail operations that compete, and even more directly, with spaza shops and independent traders. The inquiry appreciates that certain recent amendments to the price discrimination provisions in the Competition Act will partially address this concern. The inquiry also appreciates that it may be counterproductive to interfere too extensively in price negotiations. However, the inquiry believes that there is a need to ensure equal treatment, especially in respect of the granting of rebates. The inquiry seeks to achieve this through recommendations which ensure transparency, fair and equal treatment in the rebates offered. In particular, suppliers of FMCG products must ensure that A, these trade terms are uniformly available to all retailers, wholesalers and buyer groups. B, the trade terms offered have an objective justification based on cost savings, efficiencies, and sales promotions. C, the trade terms and conditions of qualification are communicated and applied uniformly. D, the rebate size is linked to the value provided rather than simply the volume purchased. And E, take measures to support qualification for rebates by wholesalers and buyer groups that supply the small and independent trade. The inquiry has outlined a framework which it initially mooted as a possible code of conduct, as a means through which the recommendations I have just outlined can be implemented. As such, the inquiry recommends that the next 6 months is used to secure voluntary commitments by FMCG suppliers to this framework. If it is not successful, then government is recommended to move to legislate this framework and provide for an ombud to police it. The inquiry similarly received complaints of differential treatment for small and independent stores in shopping mall developments in terms of rental rates charged and their related increases. The inquiry was concerned that the benefit of ending exclusivity provisions may be undermined if these small and independent stores are not fairly treated by the landlords. This is particularly so because it appears that the negotiations between the landlords and the national supermarket chains, among other factors, have a bearing on the rental rates charged to these smaller line tenants. As with suppliers, the inquiry recognized that it is not desirable for it to interfere in rental negotiations across thousands of malls and tenants, and therefore also recommends a lighter touch fair trading regime for shopping malls. In this context, the inquiry recommends that shopping mall owners must use fair, transparent, and commercially justifiable criteria to determine differences in rental rates, lease deposits, and shop fitting allowances within a property, and ensure the rental escalation formula are uniform across customers unless there are commercially justifiable reasons for differences. Once more, the inquiry recommends a period of 6 months be used to secure voluntary compliance within the inquiry's framework before moving to legislate this and policing it with an ombud. The inquiry also found that concentration at the retail level has ripple effects down and up the value chain. And for this reason, the inquiry recommends that smaller suppliers are given more support. The amendments to introduce buyer power provisions in the Competition Act provide one means of support and are welcomed by the inquiry, along with the Commission's enforcement guidelines. The inquiry also recommends the fact that the national chains have some program of smaller supplier development. The inquiry recommends the industry formalize this commitment and set minimum and progressing targets for smaller supplier sales in their stores. The third issue is regulatory and competitiveness support. The inquiry found that the South African spaza shops have faced a shifting competitive environment since the end of apartheid. On the one hand, they have seen the entry of national retail chains into township areas. The supermarkets have made bulk, weekly and monthly shopping more accessible for non-urban residents, with the benefits of lower prices and product variety. But at the same time, they've also eaten into the daily top-up and convenience shopping that characterizes the spaza shopping expedition in townships. The inquiry found that due to the bulk versus convenience shopping expedition focus, there is scope for coexistence and for spaza shops to survive and thrive. However, the regulatory and infrastructural environment favors the national chains and fails the spaza shop owners. Apartheid-era trading times and slow, inflexible, and costly zoning laws have hindered spaza shops from responding to entry and fulfilling their convenience role. This has been exacerbated by a lack of basic trading infrastructure, mainly capital for setting this up, and crime, which is cited as the biggest impediment to business. It discourages custom early morning and evenings and forces spaza shop owners to hold limited stock. At the same time, national chains are given prime locations near transport hubs and infrastructure by municipalities. The township malls constructed then exclude scope for small and informal businesses in the demarcated area. On the other hand, township trading has seen the entry of immigrant community retailers. The tight-knit nature of immigrant communities has enabled them to cooperate collectively to bulk purchase and distribute more efficiently and raise credit for the new stores. Their trading experience gained in their less concentrated and corporatized retail home markets has also stood in good stead in competing against local small and independent retailers. An example is their ability to offer residents a more extensive stock range in smaller packaging as a response to the affordability dynamics of the communities they serve. They have also benefited from the lax enforcement of counterfeit cigarettes and other goods. The inquiry found that the domestic spaza shop owners are unable to replicate these advantages, being less integrated into buying groups and unable to access lines of credit. The inquiry believes that there is a need for a change in the approach to economic development at the local municipality level, particularly insofar as it relates to offering greater support to informal and township trading businesses. These businesses have a role in the township economy and offer a means for people to participate as business owners in the economy. First, there has to be a removal of regulatory obstacles, with revisions to trading times, the introduction of proactive zoning, enhanced law enforcement, and the registration of businesses to track informal economic activity. This will require coordination across spheres of government to achieve a common approach. Second, there needs to be a conscious effort to set up an infrastructure in support of informal and township businesses, including lighting and sanitation, as well as restrictions placed on new developments, such as they must accommodate space for independent and historically disadvantaged retailers. The inquiry also believes that government should support the integration of spaza shops into beneficial buyer groups and distribution networks to meet the entry of more professional trading. This should involve facilitating and harnessing the existing entrepreneurial efforts, and to do so by facilitating the establishment of distribution centers and wholesale markets in township areas, providing seed finance for innovative commercial models that seek to incorporate spaza shops into buyer groups and logistics chains, and to put in place the preconditions for credit extension and provide business management support. In conclusion, the inquiry strongly believes that a less concentrated grocery retail sector with a large ecosystem of small independent traders alongside national retail chains is in the best interests of the economy and the consumers. Independent retailers provide important avenues for participation in the economy, provide support for smaller suppliers further up the value chain, while also offering consumers greater product choice. There is still a role for large supermarkets for the bulk shopping experience, but this should not be to the exclusion of others. The inquiry trusts that its recommendations are well received and the Commission, as well as broader government institutions, will study its findings and implement its recommendations. And before I hand over this final report to the Commissioner, I would like to take this time to acknowledge the support that the panel has received from the technical team, some of whom have left the Commission. I would like to thank Ms. Louise Duplessis, Ms. Sunel Grumbeek, and Yongaman Jazani, who were the first, second, and final heads of the technical team. I also want to acknowledge Ms. Zania Yakwana, Ms. Nonjubulo Sambo, Ms. Nonkuleko Moketsi, Ms. Lerato Moore, Ms. Kiabetswe Majapelo, and Ms. Louise Clark, who provided economic support to the panel Mr. Hugh Tlamini, Mr. Tabo Kamalo, Mr. Yarav Parveze provided invaluable legal support. I'd also like to acknowledge those of the technical team that remained and saw this project to its completion. Thank you, Ms. Nomsa Mokwena and Ms. Zentle Kele for their administrative support. I also want to thank Ms. Queen Ketsi, Mr. Ian Brzak, Ms. Beverly Chamela for the economic support, and Ms. Nyadzani Mabasa, Priya Reddy, and Ms. Suela Moshoma for their legal support. I am pleased to say that I was able to mispronounce a white person's name. So now I have to hand it over. Where is the Commissioner? It's all yours now, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Master of Ceremonies, and I'd like to also join in welcoming the Minister to this briefing session and thank him for his attendance. We know, Minister, the demands on your time, and the DTI is much bigger now, so we appreciate that you still make the time to attend these important events. And also to welcome the panel, although they have been with us for quite some time now at the Commission, our staff and members of the media and all of you who are here today. It's indeed quite an important day for us. It's a culmination of what's been a fairly long process. I remember very well going to see Professor Chidle at his office in Cape Town in December 2014, asking him if he would agree to head this inquiry. Since then, I think we have had quite a long engagement, both with the stakeholders, the panel itself, especially the industry as a stakeholder. So I'd like to acknowledge the work that has gone into this, as the chair has already thanked all those who were involved in doing all of this work. Just to take you back a little on why the retail sector is so much important and why we spend so much time and resources into it. The Commission has set itself a mission of regulating for a growing and inclusive economy. And I'm not just throwing in words. The operating words here are growing and inclusive. And the retail sector, as one of the really trading sectors in the economy, seem like one of those where barriers to entry should be low if just one looks at how retail is done, the history of participation by almost all communities in this type of sector. It seemed like a sector that should have low barriers and allow for greater participation, especially by small and medium enterprises as well as HDIs. It also is a vehicle through which many other suppliers can participate in markets. They are really the gatekeepers. If you are producing almost anything, it has to go through retail. And food retail is particularly large. So whether someone is an emerging farmer, a manufacturer, this is the type of platform that one is going to need to get into market. So it's a very, very important entry point, a very important gate towards market. So it was very important for us to understand how it operates so that we can see how wide is the gate opened. Of course, even before the inquiry, there was evidence that concentration was quite high. We had done some work before on this, including measures, that did indicate to us that South Africa was perhaps a little unusual in the sense that you had the largest supermarket chains owning a larger part of the market or controlling a larger part of the market. And there were complaints also we started receiving, for an example, on long-term lease agreements, which other people attribute to some form of market dominance, discriminatory rebate system, which favored larger buyers. There were tensions between locals and foreign nationals, and the center of these were informal markets, particularly what we call spaza shops. There was also, I think, even you could see this physically, the presence of supermarkets in the townships as well as retailers encroaching into that space. So we could see that there was a level of unhappiness and anxiety about these markets. But we also thought that there was a huge potential. So I am not going to go through the recommendations because Professor Chidel has done that very well. I will just maybe point out 2 or 3 issues that I think are emerging, which are quite important. One of them, I think it has been mentioned, which is old but has kind of reached a particular momentum more recently, is the incumbents expanding into the townships through the spaza shops model. I think that we've seen announcements by the large retailers, literally in the past few months, kind of intensifying this trend. I think that's going to be a very important issue moving forward. There is also, I think, a lot of debate now about foreign ownership of spaza shops, which also is an emerging issue more recently, which you will not find covered in the report. Professor Chidel touched the issue of crime. They did a survey, the technical team, on what are the causes for people, what is hindering the growth of spaza shops. And I think this is a point that's very, very important for the economy more generally. It's clear that crime is a very big hindrance. So in a cash economy like ourselves, really people cannot run spaza shops. They cannot even run service stations in the township because there is cash there, and where you have problems of safety, those types of businesses cannot grow. But I'm sure that we lament about this in relation to spaza shops. I have no doubt that if you talk to even larger businesses, you will find a similar concern. And I know that this is an issue that the panel considered quite a lot, and it's quite complex for us to address. The other issues of competition did emerge in the survey, but they were not as important as crime. So they did raise, I think number 2 was the competition from other spaza shops. So this would include spaza shops owned by foreign nationals. They did raise the issue of large supermarket chains getting into the townships. So these are important, but I think they gave us what was a very interesting kind of order of importance of all of these. So I kind of liked that from the report. The other issue that I'm going to mention probably as the last one observation is this issue of how informal should be spaza shops and the informal sector. You know, should it be so informal that we don't know who is operating? You know, there is no registration system. There is no clear zoning on where people should operate. All of these issues around trading hours and so on seem to be quite important for these markets. Of course, you don't want to constrain them, but you don't want informality to a point where there is lawlessness. And I think that did come up. So these issues about counterfeit goods, for example, and so on, mean that there is a little bit of enforcement that's required of all sorts of laws, bylaws, and so on. But I think that also the inquiry couldn't just, you know, this is quite a complex area. It includes multiple levels of government. Municipalities especially are particularly difficult because there are so many. But there were issues raised around that. So I'm sure that there are going to be issues of coordination that emerge out of this between various spheres of government. So what's next for the Commission itself? Well, we gave the panel a responsibility, but it seems that they have thrown it back at us in some respects. The Commission has to finalize conclude these voluntary agreements. I think the approach is good and is consistent with what we've done before, which is that get the industry to do certain things voluntarily by themselves before you can consider introducing either regulations or even prosecutions. So that work will continue within the next 6 months. We also, from our side, will set up a team. It will still be constituted by some of the members of the technical team that is going to now advocate for implementation of these recommendations. So there's still a lot more to be done to really open up these markets. And so in conclusion, I would also like to echo the chairperson of the panel's appreciation to all of those who were involved, the technical team. But more particularly, I would also like to thank the panel itself for all the work that they have put into this. I know that it was quite a complex exercise. It was big because it's a big market by its very nature. So trying to talk to all of the stakeholders, spaza shops who are scattered all over the country in big cities, small towns, rural areas, was no mean task. And I thank you for all the time you've set aside and effort made. And I'd like to thank also everybody at the Commission who put shoulder to wheel, management, Deputy Commissioner Rashisusu, for the guidance they gave to the technical team and generally all the support towards organizing the entire thing up to this very final launch of this inquiry. Minister, thanks very much once more. We really appreciate your leadership and for constantly encouraging us to do this work. We are hugely indebted to you. So thanks very much. I now officially hand over the report to the Minister.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioner, now over to the Minister for a few remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Program Director. And may I acknowledge the presence of Commissioner Bonakele, who has led the Commission through the period to the conclusion of this report. Deputy Commissioner Ratshisusu has played a significant role in guiding the work of the Commission. The Acting Deputy Commissioner James Hodge is also the Chief Economist of the Commission. Of course, today the focus is on the panel reports. I'd like to acknowledge the panel chairperson, Professor Halton Chidel, and panel member Lulama Mtanga, who have together marshaled all the work that has resulted in today's report. And there's a group of technical support and expertise that really made all of the work possible. Professor Chidel has thanked them all by name. I'd like to acknowledge Yongama and Chisani, the head of the technical team, and members of the media, members of the Commission staff, ladies and gentlemen. When the new administration took office after the election some 6 months ago, President Ramaphosa set a number of objectives. He set the objective to grow the size of the economy at a faster rate. He set the objective to improve the level of economic inclusion, particularly of young people, of women, of small and medium enterprises, and of Black South Africans. He set the objective to increase employment and to support efforts to improve living standards. Now, the relevance of that set of objectives for the sixth administration is that the Competition Act is a key enabler, one of number of measures that is available to the state, but it's a key enabler to achieve these objectives. To do so, though, is more than simply administrative fiat. It's not simply presidents and cabinets making decisions. Those decisions rely on good data, information about what the dynamics of markets are, good insights into practices, and above all, policy options that can be considered, that can be tested, and that give us the optimum policy outcomes. Market inquiries are really a key way in which we can marshal that set of information, market dynamics, insights, and options, and put them to policymakers. And in the period since the start of this administration, the Commission has sought to step up the pace of work for the market inquiries to enable the administration relatively early in its term of office to have that information available so that it may use the period in office to achieve the objectives that were set in the State of the Nation address by President Ramaphosa. So we've had, among others, the private healthcare market inquiry report that was released, the grocery retail market inquiry report that is now here with us today, and the data services market inquiry that I am advised will be available before the end of the year. And what these market inquiry reports do is they provide us with the insights, as I've indicated, to be able to achieve the objectives that we've set ourselves in this administration. So for that reason, I welcome this report. It's a very substantial report, 600 pages, Professor Chidel, 600 pages, a very substantial report. And it's about a market that, as Commissioner Bonakele said, is quite an important market for the South African economy. The retail grocery sector provides an entry point for young entrepreneurs, small players, female entrepreneurs to come into the economy. And in many cases, the experience that's gained when entering retail, the business skills that are developed, stand those entrepreneurs in good stead as they diversify to other sectors of the economy. So call it the incubation sector of the South African economy. Second, it affects cost of living, because the cost of retailing and the terms that retail can extract from manufacturers help to shape the prices that consumers ultimately pay. And grocery shopping constitute, in large part, one or set of basic necessities that families and households rely on. And third, of course, retail in general and grocery retail also are key drivers of demand for products that are either locally made or that are imported. It's off the back of consumer demand, of course. They're an intermediary between consumers and producers, but a well-functioning retail sector can help to stimulate demand for locally produced goods. They can help to facilitate the entry of smaller manufacturers and suppliers of goods into markets. So for all these reasons, I'm delighted that we have before us today a considered piece of work that sets out the findings of a panel of experts supported by a good technical team, and that provides a roadmap to government. The grocery retail sector is one with significant strengths in South Africa. I have visitors frequently commenting about the size and the significance of the shopping mall experience, and the report documents many of those strengths. At the same time, there are also serious challenges. And Professor Cheadle commented about the need to have a large, thriving and dynamic ecosystem of small and independent grocery retailers and specialist food stores. And by and large, I think our observation and the results of the report is we have not yet achieved that. We have some way to go to be able to achieve that large, thriving, dynamic ecosystem of small and independent grocery retailers and specialist food stores. When I think about the last few weeks and my own observations over that period, carrying out other official responsibilities not tied to the market inquiry, but seeing how connected they are to the outcomes of the inquiry. For example, in this last 2-week period, I attended the BRICS summit with a delegation led by the president, and this summit took place in Brazil. And when you travel in Brazil, what strikes you, one of the most visible differences between Brazil and South Africa is the existence of a much stronger and bigger and more thriving small-scale retail sector. What struck us also is in the summit declaration endorsed by the 5 heads of state, particular attention was drawn to the need to address some forms of illicit trading practices, including, and specific attention was drawn to under-invoicing, which enables illicit goods to enter domestic markets, and the market inquiry speaks quite specifically to that. In my bilateral meetings with counterpart trade ministers, the importance of the small and medium enterprise sector was highlighted. In bilaterals with the Indian trade minister, he outlined to me the measures that were being considered in India to support and protect the large and quite dynamic small retail sector. And that included measures that effectively gave those retailers, those small retailers, preferential access to markets in India. I went to Egypt on Friday for an investment conference. And Egypt, like Brazil, is characterized by the proliferation of small retail, of informal markets that constitute a very significant place where Egyptians buy and sell their goods. In this 2-week period also, my staff have prepared for me feedback on the publication, the gazetting of a set of draft regulations dealing with matters that speak powerfully to the outcome of the market inquiry. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, I think these are not pure coincidences. They are that in different places and in different ways in our own country, we're all grappling with how to build greater levels of inclusion. The panel did it. We're doing it as government on a regular basis. Other governments elsewhere in the world are grappling with this. One of the more significant pieces of legislation that was passed by Parliament in the 5th administration was the Competition Amendment Act. And recently we published for comment a set of regulations to give effect to important new provisions in those Act. I want to point to 3 particular changes in the Act that foregrounds the report today. The first, we introduced in the Act, for the first time in our competition law, the concept of buyer power and the abuse of buyer power. And so the law now says for the first time that it's prohibited for a dominant firm in a sector to directly or indirectly require from or impose on a supplier that is a small and medium business or a firm controlled or owned by historically disadvantaged persons unfair prices or other trading conditions. So we've now opened up the relationship between suppliers and buyers as a legitimate area of scrutiny of the competition authorities to ensure that we achieve greater levels of economic inclusion. Secondly, we've sharpened the provisions in the law dealing with price discrimination to point to the relationship between price discrimination and small and medium enterprises. And the new law says an action by a dominant firm as the seller of goods or services is prohibited price discrimination if it is likely to have the effect of impeding the ability of small and medium businesses or firms controlled or owned by historically disadvantaged persons to participate effectively. And then third, we've also improved the language and the tests applicable to predatory pricing, which is, of course, the practice where a dominant player maintains its dominance by reducing prices when faced with competition by new entrants and smaller players in order to knock them out and thereafter raise prices again. Now, each of these practices, to a greater or lesser extent, it has been contended by smaller players, hold them back from building dynamic, thriving businesses and from that sector of small retailers growing in size and importance in our economy. We've also strengthened the provisions on market inquiries. This inquiry was, of course, conducted under the rules and the provisions of the Act before the amendments, but in future, and building on the experience we've gained here, we are able to give to the authorities, the competition authorities, a stronger set of tools that will enable proper remedial action in cases of market concentration and in practices that impede or restrict competition. Now, I raise that because I've been presented officially by Commissioner Bonakele a 600-page tome. I have to study it. I've not had a prior copy of the 600-page version, so I don't have as much to say on the document as yet until I've had an opportunity to study it. But there are some key metrics that have already been pointed out in both the executive summary and by Professor Cheadle. They include that malls are a key feature of our retail space, that there are more than 2,000 malls, and it seems that malls are growing quite fast. That they represent, from the work of the market inquiry, roughly 50% of all grocery sales. So they constitute a critical driver of grocery retailing. The report also indicates that on the available evidence before the market inquiry, some 70% of shopping malls have some form of exclusivity leasing arrangements in place. And the report also points to what it regards as fairly significant levels of market concentration, with the top 5 retailers accounting for 64% of market share. Professor Cheadle has taken you through some of the key findings of the inquiry in respect of exclusive leases and the impact those leases have on the emergence of smaller and more nimble competitors, fair trading provisions, which the report finds in a number of cases act to hamstring the smaller players, and the regulatory and competitive support framework that the report indicates is in need of a significant review to enable a stronger support for smaller players. What comes out of this is that the report asks each of the key players to do something different. It puts a responsibility on the lease initiators, the mall owners and property developers, to act in a different way. It requires from the anchor tenants and the large grocery retailers in the shopping malls a different and new model of competition. It has a set of recommendations that affect the state at local municipality right through to national level, and requires the state to play a different role. And it requires small spaza shops and smaller retailers to also, in collaboration with government, to up their game in respect of the distribution networks that they put in place and the infrastructure support that the state needs to render, and the removal of unnecessary regulatory constraints that impede small players. So really, it's all of us are being asked to do things differently if we want different outcomes. I welcome the approach in the report that talks about essentially a 6-month voluntary compliance window to take the insights and the findings and convert that to an agreement to operate in a different way. And there are some very concrete proposals that are set out in the report on what is required. If at the end of this voluntary compliance window we are able to achieve the outcomes that we seek, and there are credible monitoring and implementation mechanisms in place that will give us the necessary reassurance, then we may well find that the social compact underlying this, the set of recommendations here, would be sufficient to enable the transformation of the retail sector to provide opportunity for young South Africans, for small and medium-sized enterprises to enter this space. If at the end of the 6-month period we have not achieved the necessary consensus in a meaningful and substantial package of reforms, then the panel requests that government utilizes a set of regulatory powers available to it to enable those outcomes. And it proposes a code of conduct as one instrument that can be introduced through regulation or appropriate legislation. So essentially what the panel is saying is, here are the insights, here are what we think are well-considered policy options available. We propose that there be an initial period to see whether we can build a consensus, and should we fail to build a consensus, we propose that the state should take action, purpose of action, and it sets those out to achieve the objectives of the Competition Act and in fact the policy objectives that President Ramaphosa set out in the State of the Nation address. So it gives us an opportunity, Commissioner, to build partnerships, to recognize some of the strengths that big players bring to our market and to our economy, and at the same time to address the burning issue of economic inclusion, of providing more opportunities for more South Africans to enter this incubation space in the economy that I spoke of earlier. So I will carefully go through the report. I will also table the report in Parliament, and I will brief Cabinet on the outcome of this report. The Small Business Development Department has already made substantial input to the Commission and to the panel during the course of the panel's consideration to address a number of concerns that smaller players have. And indeed, that is particularly helpful. And when we've considered this report, we will also seek to support efforts in the 6-month window period to get a consensus between the players and then report back to Cabinet on the outcome of that consensus building process. And then Cabinet will have to weigh it and say, this is a great set of outcomes. The parties have all agreed on what is needed in future, and it can then give its stamp of approval. Or if indeed we have not quite achieved it, it would then give the green light for us to introduce such regulatory measures as may be necessary. So Helton, Professor Cheadle, and Lulama, can I, on behalf of the Ministry, thank the two of you. I know you didn't do the work alone, but the panel members drove a lot of the work of the technical teams. You became the interface with many of the parties, and you're to distill the insights into a set of recommendations that I can now look at. Commissioner, you've played quite a key role from the period where we introduced the market inquiry concept in our law to experimenting with new approaches. And I recognize you've taken a very different approach in this market inquiry compared to the private healthcare market inquiry. And that is, I think, given us new models that can be utilized in future. The technical team from James Hodge, who made sure that the economics that underlies the report has been well considered, and Yongama, you and the team that had to do all the data gathering, speak to small spaza shop owners and big retailers and integrate all of their views. I'd like to extend my appreciation to all of you. Deputy Commissioner, you too, Commissioner, told me that he had asked you to support and assist the work of the market inquiry, and we really appreciate your work in this regard. So thank you then for this heavy set of reading. I thought once I do all my travel, I can sit back in December and read some novels. And there goes that idea. I will have to apply my mind to 600 pages of facts, figures, graphs, and economic equations. So once again, thank you very much to everybody for facilitating the completion of this report. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Let me say at this point, the speech by Professor is available. I think it has been sent to everyone who's here now. But also the report will be available anytime from now on our website. Now we are going to open for questions and clarifications. We have a roving mic. So anyone who has questions to the panel with regards to the report, we are taking those questions now. We start in front, which is number 1, number 2. Okay. Please, let's make sure that for now the questions and clarifications are open to the members of the media. So if you can prioritize the members of the media for now. So you mention your name and your institution, and then we'll take 5 questions or 5 people with questions, and then see if there are any other after that round. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Tebogo Tshwane. I'm a journalist at MoneyWeb. Professor Cheadle, you mentioned that the inquiry has initiated the process to get voluntary undertakings from national supermarket chains to put an end to these exclusive leases. I just want to get a sense from you of how that process went about and what kind of reception you received from these national supermarkets. Was there any unwillingness on their behalf, or has it been smooth sailing?
It's Ray Mahlaka from Daily Maverick. My question is about after the process of the supermarket chains voluntarily working with the Competition Commission, and failing which the government would introduce legislation or regulations. My understanding is that the Competition Commission is already empowered through the Competition Act to impose sanctions such as fines, monetary fines, and even imprisonment for breaches of the Competition Act. Why would the Competition Commission seek to introduce further legislation or regulation when it's already empowered under the Competition Act to impose breaches to sections of the Act? Thanks.
I'll give over to that gentleman.
My name is Andrew Jardam. I'm from one of the challenger retailers, Liquor City. And my question is for the panel relating to the existing exclusivity that's currently in place. In the preliminary report in May, you indicated that it would be phased out in 2 years. In this report, you indicate that it should be phased out in 5. Why? What is the reasoning behind that extension? And if you're looking to create inclusion, wouldn't you reduce it from 2 years to 12 months per se?
So we now have no further questions. I'll now hand over to the panel.
Okay, I will just my colleague Lulama here, I just do want to say that she was utterly invaluable and really utterly critical to this report. And I failed to mention it in my quick summation on all the people that have assisted in this process, and I do want to do that. And for that remark, she's now going to have to assist me in answering the questions. Let me start with the voluntary process. The voluntary process began with us engaging with the national retailers. We had formulated a set of undertakings, and you can begin to see the outline of what that undertaking looks like in the recommendations themselves. And just given the necessity to bring this inquiry to an end, we weren't able to finally get buy-in from everyone, but we would never have made the recommendation for the Commission to continue the process if we didn't believe that, in principle, all the national retailers will submit to an undertaking and a process. So it's not just simply a set of undertakings, but it's also a process of ensuring compliance with those undertakings and for it to be voluntary. Let me come to the second point, is that the question is, given the fact that the Act has all these powers and penalties and sanctions, really, I think, and I'm going to ask Lulama to answer as well, my response is that takes a long time. Here, it seems to me that there was a real possibility that we were going to get voluntary buy-in from these national supermarkets chains and the suppliers, and just so much easier to achieve and more quickly to achieve. Lulama,
just on the first question from the lady from MoneyWeb, in addition to what Professor Chill has said, I just want to say we did embark on that process of trying to get consensus and buy-in from the retailers, as he has said. But we also found that each retailer would try and negotiate from the perspective of its own interests. And we ended up having these divergent approaches to how they would like to see the process pan out. So, and then if we try to accommodate or sat down to look at how we then could come up with a consensus from those divergent views that were emerging in the interactions that we had and engagements we had with them, it would have taken us way beyond the period that we had to conclude this inquiry. So there has been cooperation from most of them, in fact all of them, but they just came up with quite divergent views. So I would like to emphasize that point. So when the Commission takes over that process, we have recommended that 6-month period because we are hoping that that period will be sufficient to give, to allow for all the parties concerned to come to some consensus on this point.
And on the issue of the 5 years, bear in mind we had a provisional report. We had extensive submissions made to the draft recommendations that we made in that report. And we've moved. And so when we look at the 5-year clause, it's really important to recognize that, first of all, that our recommendation is that with immediate effect, national supermarket chains will not enforce those exclusivity arrangements in relation to SMMEs, specialty stores, and other grocery retailers. All right. located in shopping centres in non-urban areas. So that's the first. The second is no new exclusive, and that's from today. All right. And then in relation to the 5-year period, most of the exclusivity clauses were around 5 years, and then they would just renew them. All right. And so the issue that we faced with in the submissions that we received, we faced the situation where they had entered into an exclusivity lease a year before, and part of the arguments about these exclusivity leases is that they are basically to cover the cost of opening up in the mall and to recover those costs. So that's really why we took the 5 years. But also read that no new leases or extension of leases. So if the extension of the lease comes up within that 5-year period, that's when it terminates. So if you had a 5-year lease that is going to be renewed next year, all right, it's from next year. So it really was only to deal with those supermarket chain, those particular exclusivity leases that were entered into, let's say, in the last year, and to ensure that they are then phased out. So it really is a very small chunk ultimately that would be affected by the 5-year lease.
I mean, maybe just to add from the Commission's perspective, as the inquiry has indicated, nothing precludes the Commission from taking forward some existing cases, and certainly in light of their recommendations and insights into exclusive leases, including the wider impact on entry and also exclusion from the economy, we're certainly going to go and revisit a number of outstanding cases which have been lodged, and over this period we will look to take those forward at the same time. I think to the question around regulation versus enforcement action, often those complaints are in respect of a local area in a particular geography over a particular issue. And so litigation by local area is not going to move us forward rapidly, and hence regulation seems appropriate as well to set a clear set of standards. And also for those that may fall out of the dominant sphere, which much of this in terms of the Act falls into. Just to also reiterate Professor Cheadle's comment on the 5 years, that really the bulk of the most offensive exclusivity around SME speciality stores, which offer that differentiation, and also non-urban areas where there's not many close competing malls, and so represent real exclusion at even a grocery retailer level. All of that is with immediate effect. The technical team did look at, amongst the national retailers, how many leases were coming off or would be renewed year on year. And just the non-renewal clause alone is probably going to bring at least 100 or so malls off exclusivity every year for the next few years. So as Professor Cheadle did say, this really is a smaller group, but is a recognition of some balance of the incentives and investments that have been made in more recent agreements. So certainly I think the impact will be substantial, and the residual will happen over an orderly phased process, which I think is a fair compromise in terms of the interests of the national retailers as well as those that wish to get access to these malls.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Just to add from what James mentioned, it's very important to recognize that the market inquiry process is much more flexible than an investigation. So whilst we accept the findings of the panel that these exclusive lease agreements are anti-competitive, formulating a case out of that is something that is going to require a whole lot more involved technical process, including how we define the markets and so on. So don't discount the value of having this recommendation implemented or a regulation, because whilst the Commission still retain that authority to pursue these existing investigations, indeed there are live complaints before us, we do think that it is much more quicker, it will bring much more quicker relief for market participants if you are able to follow through on the market inquiry recommendations. Of course, the Commission will never take away from the table the possibility of enforcement, and that we can do at any time. But we have also noted that there is 6 months that's been given to allow for the industry to voluntarily do this, and we would like to give that process to see how it resolves matters. So thanks very much.
I seem to have one more question right at the back. If there is no other question, that would be the last one before we then conclude.
Hi, my name is Catherine Child. I'm from Business Day. I have 2 questions. I'm just going to stand because I can't see you. I had covered the health market inquiry because I was a health writer, and they faced a lot of legal challenges that dragged out the health process on and on and on. So were there any legal challenges that tried to stop this or drag it out or made you change your findings? That's the one. So did any of the big players challenge you legally? And the second is, you say that foreign-owned shops in townships, they benefit from being foreigners and working together. But I mean, surely if they choose to work together, buy together at a discount, warehouse and transport goods together, there's nothing stopping local spaza shops doing that. I mean, that's a choice by the foreigners. It's a good business choice. Is there anything stopping local South African spaza shops warehousing or shopping together, buying together?
Thank you. So that was the last question.
Thanks, Catherine. On your first question, no, we did not face any serious legal challenges. I'll say challenges that were legal, we were able to address on paper, and I guess to the satisfaction of the stakeholders that raised them. As to whether there's still others that are looming in the report or where stakeholders would like to raise, we're not aware. But we certainly did not experience any of the challenges that we experienced by the health inquiry. On the cooperation that exists amongst foreign nationals and the lack of amongst local spaza shop owners, we've come to understand, and from this inquiry, that it's actually one of the features that exists in an immigrant kind of culture community. They tend to work together, so it is not so easy for locals to work so efficiently in a coordinated manner, in the manner in which foreign nationals are able to. So that's the only answer we are able to provide you with. Catherine.
Well, I would just like to add, I mean, on the, we did get submissions on challenges where they challenged the fact that we didn't have the definition of market and various of it, but none that ever surfaced as a formal challenge. And I think that we were able to answer them, and you'll find in the report we do deal with the legal issues raised, and I think that we properly answered them. In relation to the foreign nationals, it's not that only they are able to put this together. What we did have evidence in KwaZulu-Natal was a whole series of endeavors to create distribution centers. So there are ideas out there. I suppose with spaza shop owners, they might well be in competition. They don't have the familial ties and clan ties, which are quite strong, particularly in relation to Somalians. So, I think all of those are the kinds of variables that explain the difference. And when you ask the question, is there anything preventing locals from doing so? No, there are no legal and obstacles. But there is a lot that could be done to facilitate it. And I think that the example in KwaZulu-Natal, where they, for the province is trying to find places in which hawkers and spas, distribution centres. Now, I think that's something that I hope that the government would take up. We raise it in the report. That seems to me something very practical that can be done for all spaza shop owners, not just, let's say, local ones.
Just to add again on one example that was pointed out to us, in Limpopo there was a group of spaza shops that had tried to come together to source or procure goods as a formation of spaza shops. And one of the major points in their submissions to us was how they were failing to gain access to suppliers. And so they found it they could not understand why they were not well received as that formation. So so there's been an attempt. It's all recent though. It has been this coordinating and working together has been a feature very prevalent amongst the foreign nationals. So the local operators, it's something that they are starting to do. And it still remains to be seen how much of that will really bring some improvement in the manner in which they access goods, as well as foreign nationals are.
Maybe if I can just add another count for the amendments as well that have been brought through. I think the amendments are also seeking to bring about or encourage a lot more of the pro-competitive, transformative, cooperative arrangements between small businesses and between historically disadvantaged businesses. And this is reflected, I suppose, in probably upcoming regulations around Section 4(1)A, which has a component of pro-competitive cooperation, but also the exemption provisions which permit for that. So I think there's also a push in more generally to facilitate those sort of arrangements so that there is more positive cooperation in this transformation of the economy.
Thank you. I just wanted to come in on two issues. The first is Ray's question, Ray from Daily Maverick. I don't know if you feel that your question has been fully answered. There's any other area, because this is quite a key. It's an innovation by the panel. And I think the panel's done actually an excellent job. And we need to ensure that in our public communication, we spell out what it is and what it is not. So I'm really putting together what has been said by the panel. Essentially, the approach it's taking is where there is a case in law to be answered, the Commission must reserve the right to pursue that case. And as always is the case, it will weigh up its prospects of success and the time taken. But a number of practices that the market inquiry has uncovered may not have been prohibited practices or clearly defined prohibited practices under the provisions of the law in the period up to the amendments. And remember, the panel was looking at past practices. And so if it, and it's really saying, I'm putting words in the panel's collective mouths, what it's saying is in anticipation of the new legislation, if we can get a voluntary agreement to cease practices that will in future be regarded as illegal practices, then we can avoid the need for expensive, risky, and time-consuming litigation. The way in which our competition law works, as in every other branch of law, is it takes a number of years for the jurisprudence to develop, for the market to know what clearly the courts have found, and there is an impatience that we all have, all South Africans have, that we want changes to be introduced quite quickly. And so this road has one of its advantages is that speed of change, rapid transformation would be achieved. But the other part, Ray, that is worth highlighting is that certain practices were not clearly prohibited in the past. For example, of the 3 areas of focus by the panel, one of it is deals with the question of buyer power, and there are quite extensive recommendations, as you will find in the report, on buyer power. We've only just introduced buyer power as a specific class of prohibited practices by dominant firms. We've just published a few, perhaps a month and a half ago or so, the draft regulations on buyer power, and we've now received substantial input from the public process, and we will be able now to finalize those. So I think it would be appropriate to say that the panel is seeking also to anticipate the changes in our law and to bring the observations they have of the current market practices in anticipation of those. James has, I think, helpfully anticipated one of the points I wanted to make in relation to Catherine's question, and that is there may have been a concern that if small players combine to ensure that they receive competitive prices, that it could be regarded as a form of collusion. We have made that now absolutely explicit. There was already a provision in the Competition Act that dealt with exemptions that may be given for the promotion of small and medium businesses. What we've done is we've done 2 changes. We've strengthened that provision. We've now said an exemption may be granted for the promotion of the effective entry into, participation in, and expansion within a market by small and medium enterprises or firms controlled or owned by historically disadvantaged persons. So it's now a much clearer category the Commission can look at. But there's another change which may not be so clear in the amendments that were introduced. And it's, if I recall, it's Section 1010 of the Competition Act. And it says the Minister may, after consultation with the Commission, and in order to give effect to the purposes of this Act, as set out in Section 2, issue regulations in terms of Section 78, exempting a category of agreements or practices from the application of this chapter. So whereas currently small players would have to apply, we now have the tool, and based on the recommendations of the panel, we can utilize the tool to set out a class or category exemption, which our law didn't previously have. I think also I want to underline something that Professor Cheadle raised, and that is the high levels of cohesion that you find in immigrant communities is not replicated, obviously, in the majority community. So you need a set of measures to try to foster and support that. There's a role there that the state can play to enable. It has to ultimately be smaller players wanting to do these things. The initiative will have to largely come from spaza shop owners and small players, but we can play a role. For example, one of the things that we can clearly do is to facilitate greater infrastructure, whether it is places where people can store their goods, access to other basic infrastructure in informal markets. All of those can help to strengthen the economic argument, and by coordinating with small players to combine their market power using the provisions now in the new Act, we can encourage the development of these buyer clubs and arrangements. So I think what has been helpful is that the panel has said the absence of that constitutes a competitive disadvantage for South African small spaza shop owners. Now that we have clear evidence to that, we can coordinate our action to try to foster and support the development of those measures. So, Commissioner, I just wanted to add those few points to the questions that were asked.
Thank you very much, Minister. Just two quick announcements before we conclude. There's a request that members of the technical team just remain before the one-on-one interviews to take some official pictures with the panel. And the second one is that next Monday and the other Monday, the 2nd of December and the 9th of December, we are likely to release the reports of the two other market inquiries, which is data and transport, land transport inquiry. So we will make those announcements in the next few days with regards to the time and location and exactly when do those take place. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today's proceedings, and thank you very much once again.